Hello, it's me again. Now, for anybody watching this remotely, I want you to understand the live stream does not fully capture the picture of what's happening right now. So something that you might not know, if you don't know me personally, I'm disabled. I have a scooter that I use to get around. You would call it a Segway if you saw it. And there's an FBI law enforcement conference near here. So they just saw a random crab on a Segway roll in front of their business conference, and I'm pretty sure I'm on like an FBI watch list now. Also, my daughter is here, and she's wearing an identical crab costume. So just to make sure that you all have the picture, if you're not here in person, there's a lot going on that you can't see. So with all that out of the way, just a quick test. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear my voice through the speakers right now. All right, I see thumbs up. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. My name is Sage Griffin. My pronouns are they, them. I'm also a bit of a hot mess. And today I am here to talk about the Rust Foundation. So for starters, I want to talk about what the Foundation actually does. And to understand that, we need to understand Section 501c6 of the United States Internal Revenue Code, which states that... Okay, I'm kidding. Stop running for the doors. We're not actually going to talk about tax code, I promise. Although that said, I do want you all to know that the relevant section of the tax code actually has like a specific call out for professional football leagues. And so that makes me really disappointed that the Rust Foundation isn't the Rust Associated Football Club. So this is Beck, our CEO. I'd like you all to go find her at the happy hour after this and tell her that you want to see AFC Rust happen. We can make this happen, people. Come on. All right, so let's get back on topic. What does the Foundation do? Well, fundamentally, we exist to support the Rust language by providing support to the Rust project and community. And this comes in a couple of different forms. At its core, the biggest thing that the Foundation does is raise funds from various companies who are using Rust and funnel it into the ecosystem. One way that this is done is through our grants program, where folks inside the project and the community submit proposals for things that they'd like to work on, and they receive funding from the Foundation in order to work on it. Now, depending on where in the world they live, this usually isn't enough to cover all of their costs. And this is why when we're able, we also hire full-time engineers whose only job is to work on the Rust project. Now, this is something we generally do pretty sparingly. We don't want to be in a situation where only a handful of people are benefiting from the Foundation's existence. But it takes a lot more than just software engineers to keep the project running. Rust has a lot of infrastructure that it relies on, and it gets really expensive. In 2022, our members donated just shy of $1 million in resources for Rust CI, file hosting, bandwidth, tools like Crater, which compile every crate on crates.io to test changes in the compiler, and more. Finally, the project has more legal needs than you might expect. Crates.io has to deal with copyright law for all of the content that it hosts. What do they do when they receive a DMCA takedown request? The project wants to continue to hold the trademark for Rust. What needs to happen to make sure that that happens? There's also random situations that come up like, hey, Rust has a lot of US contributors. Do we need to care about the US sanctions on Iran when reviewing pull requests? I know this sounds like a ridiculous question to be asking, but back during my time when I was leading the Crates.io team, this was an actual question I had to talk to lawyers to answer. Also, in most countries, people can just sue you, like, for any reason. What does a project member do if they get sued for work that they did on behalf of the project? All of these situations require legal resources, which the Foundation provides. So a huge portion of the support that we provide goes to the Rust project. But who actually is the Rust project? And this is a really surprisingly nebulous question. I could probably spend 30 minutes up here just trying to answer that question definitively. But for our purposes, I'm going to go with the very, very short answer of it's the group of people who are governed by the Rust Leadership Council. Now, the project is entirely independent of the Foundation. It is the sole group that's responsible for the steering and technical decisions of the language. We provide support to them. Sometimes we act as stewards on their behalf, but we do not have any direct control over them. And we'll talk more about how that relationship is codified in a bit. But first, I want y'all to remember we are at high altitude, and that means you need to be drinking more water than you normally would. The Rust Foundation cares about Rustation hydration, so let's all take a moment and have a drink of water. All right, so we've talked about the ways in which we support the language, but what else does the Foundation do? Well, occasionally situations will arise where we need a legal entity that can reasonably claim to be Rust. And being that entity is another reason that another role that the Foundation plays. So when the Foundation was originally formed, the MVP, the Minimum Viable Foundation, was a legal entity which can hold the Rust trademark that isn't Mozilla. Mozilla held the trademark at the time and did not want to continue doing so. But trademarks aren't the only situation where this need for a legal entity can come up. I'd like to tell you about a case where this happened during my time as co-lead of the Crates.io team. This was many years ago, before the Foundation existed. GitHub had just released an early preview of a new feature where it would automatically inform you if you pushed an access token to a service like AWS, to a public repository, meaning that anybody could build things to your account. And because this was such an early preview of the feature, it was really focused on major companies like Amazon. There wasn't an easy way for open source projects like Crates.io to join. But I had a decent number of friends who worked there, so I pulled some strings and I got in touch with the team that was working on this feature. And since this was such an early release, there were a few things that needed to happen first. And the big one was signing a bunch of legal documents. Now, I just want to be clear. This isn't meant to rag on GitHub at all, or as my British coworkers would say, at all. At the time, the problem that they were trying to solve was people accidentally leaking their keys for something like S3, which is Amazon's file hosting service, and then getting hit with some massive AWS bill when somebody starts mining cryptocurrency on their account. It's completely reasonable that GitHub had expectations that were meant for these big companies. The feature was still being worked on. But I wasn't a company. I was a single open source contributor. So my reaction was like, can I sign this? Like I can sign it for myself, but I don't think I have the authority to sign a contract on behalf of everybody else in the Rust project. But it wasn't an option at the time. I spent some time talking to folks within Mozilla Legal to see if it was possible to have them act as this legal entity since they owned the trademark for Rust, but it wasn't something they were willing to do, and honestly, I don't blame them. So this just didn't end up happening. GitHub recommended that we set something up on Open Collective, but I was just one person in the project. I wasn't on the core team. I didn't feel like I had the clout to push anything like that through. I just want to reiterate, I'm not trying to rag on GitHub. I don't think there was anything wrong with how they handled things. Once this feature left its preview status, a lot of this bureaucracy went away. And eventually the Crates.io team did get integrated with this service. And today, if you publish your Crates.io token to a public GitHub repository, it'll automatically be revoked and you'll be informed. So I don't think anything was wrong about this was wrong on GitHub's part. But the project just wasn't set up to engage with corporations like that at the time. And so while this case worked out in the end, there's plenty of cases where this sort of bureaucracy just never goes away. At the end of the day, any entity signing something like an NDA on behalf of an open source project really is pretty pointless. I know there's some team members out here. Show of hands, how many of you have considered whether the Rust Foundation has signed an NDA when you're writing a pull request? Yeah, 0. That's exactly what I thought. But saying that bureaucracy like this shouldn't exist doesn't make it so. This isn't something that people come to open source to deal with, which is why we need a foundation to deal with it for you. And this comes up in more cases than just signing legal documents. Dealing with giant corporations as an individual contributor can be incredibly overwhelming. In the years prior to the foundation forming, I was working on Crace.io full-time, which meant that I needed to find funding in order to pay my bills. Now, at the time, it was pretty easy for me to get some support from Mozilla, since they actually had a team that was dedicated to Rust. And that team had a manager who I knew and I could talk to, and that person had a budget that they could pull from in order to fund me. But I wasn't expecting them to cover my costs forever. I wasn't a Mozilla employee. So I needed to get support from other companies. And at the time, I would hear a lot of chatter. Oh, Google wants to give more money to Rust. Microsoft wants to give more money to Rust. And like, it was really great hearing that, and it would get me really excited. But then I'm like, how do I, as an individual who's contributing to Rust, who has bills to pay, get connected to a person in these massive companies who cares about Rust, knows about the work that I'm doing, and actually has the authority to sign this contract funding my work? Navigating those structures was extremely time-consuming. And I sucked at it. I was a programmer. I wanted to spend my time programming. But I was spending a third to a half of my time just trying to make sure I could pay my bills. And at that point, it was just easier for me to take a part-time job and not have to deal with this bullshit. And now it's time for another hydration break, brought to you by the Rust Foundation. The Foundation cares about Rustation hydration, so let's all take a moment to drink some water. So you may be asking, if the companies give money to the foundation, and then the foundation uses that money to pay full-time engineers to work on Rust, why don't we just have those people work for these companies directly? And there's a couple of different answers to that question, but the first answer is, they do. The foundation employing engineers isn't mutually exclusive with our members hiring folks to work on Rust full-time. Many of our member companies have multiple people who work on the compiler or other parts of the project, and we encourage that. But we would be in a worse situation if that was the only way people got hired to do open source full-time. When you work in open source, one of your biggest concerns is always your job security. When times get tough, open source contributors are often the first positions that get cut. After all, you're not bringing anything to the company's bottom line, and it's an open source project. If the company isn't paying somebody to do the work, somebody else will just come and do it for free, right? This sounds hyperbolic, but these are actual things I've been told in the past when I was working on open source full-time and my job was getting cut. It's a big part of when I went full-time on Crace.io. I wanted to find ways to pay my bills that didn't require working for a single company. It's also why I feel more secure working at the foundation than I ever did when I was working in open source full-time. I'm sure most of us can remember back when Mozilla had to lay off pretty much its entire Rust team, and that had such a big impact that people were questioning the future of the language. That's not an issue when folks work for the foundation. We're all working on open source in some form or another, so nobody's going to get cut because open source is the least important thing. It's our very reason for existing. And we don't face the same economic pressures that our member companies do. Now, that's not to say that we're completely immune when times get tough. When layoffs are happening, we're actually hearing the same thing as the rest of you. Yes, that's right, we too get macroeconomic conditions. Chances are, if you're being told that despite record profits this quarter, you won't be receiving a raise due to macroeconomic conditions, well, we're also seeing our budget get hit. And that might happen in the form of companies reducing their membership tier or reducing the amount that they contribute to initiatives like our community grants program. Now, that said, when our funding does get reduced, the impact can be somewhat lessened by the diversity of our sources of funding. Nobody's job at the foundation is tied to the donations of a single company. If funding from one company starts to lapse, we can fill the gaps with other companies rather than having to lay people off. But reductions in our budget do still have a visible impact on some of our shorter-term investments. For example, this year we were only able to issue about half as many grants as we were last year due to reduced funding. And when this most recent round of grants went out, many people pointed out how little it would have cost to maintain our budget from previous years when you look at the scale of our members' pocketbooks. And they're right. So speaking only for myself and not for anybody else on staff, I shared people's frustration at just how small of an impact it would have had. But a company being a foundation member doesn't mean that we have infinite access to their pocketbooks. We still need these companies to contribute when we have initiatives to fund. If you work for a member company right now, you can help by trying to pressure your leadership internally to increase their membership tier or to give additional contributions to things like our community grants program. And if you work for a company that isn't a foundation member, please consider asking them to join. Silver memberships in particular are surprisingly affordable for small businesses. If you know me, I shout this a lot. It's really ridiculous how affordable it is. Another way that companies hiring folks can fall short is that generally you only get those positions if you're already a major open source contributor. There's some exceptions here, but if you look at the people that large companies are employing to work on open source full-time, it tends to be almost entirely prolific open source contributors who had a bunch of contributions already when they got this job. And it's great that this happens, especially because these folks deserve much higher salaries than the foundation can offer, but it also leaves a lot of gaps. If you want to contribute to open source full-time, you should not need to spend a bunch of nights and weekends doing unpaid labor as a prerequisite for that. And more often than not, the way that people are getting hired in these positions is they have open source work that they've already done, and they're just looking for someone to pay them to continue doing it. And that's great, but that's not the entire problem of the maintainability of open source. These companies aren't in a good position to determine whether a team that exists within the Rust project could use more support and actively hire to increase their headcount. Now, by contrast, the foundation is frequently in contact with all of the Rust teams. And when we find that we have the budget to bring on another engineer, we're in a really great position to reach out to all of them and see what teams might be interested in bringing on someone new. And this also is a great opportunity for us to open doors for someone who might not have otherwise been able to contribute to open source. This is also something we focus on within our community grants program. We work with the Rust teams to find out where there is bandwidth to help mentor and onboard new contributors. And then we ensure that every year, some of our grants are going to less experienced people, and we help them get started with contributing. And the hope is that this acts as an on-ramp for new contributors to the project. Many of these people go on to become team members or even pursue a career in open source full-time. Now, when you work full-time in open source, one thing that really starts to come to mind is who determines your priorities? So I had an experience many years back when I was working on Ruby on Rails full-time. And this became an issue for me. When I was hired, there was an understanding between me and the company that I would be doing what was best for the Rails project. And that might not always align with the company. Now, I focused mostly on database driver code. The majority of new Rails apps at the time were using PostgreSQL, but the company I worked for used MySQL. The difference between those is not even remotely important for you to understand, but they're incompatible feature sets, and work that benefits one doesn't always benefit users of the other. And over time, I started getting told that on my work time, I couldn't work on Postgres-specific features anymore since the company didn't directly benefit from them. But that was the best use of my time for the majority of Rails users. And when you're an open source maintainer, that's the sort of interference you just don't want to have. You want to always be able to do what's best for your users. And so by having the foundation sit in the middle, we can insulate our engineers from these sorts of issues. Now, it's not to say our employees are completely immune from corporate influence. Oftentimes, funding that we get comes with some strings attached, such as, this money needs to be spent to improve Rust's open source supply chain security. Is anyone else really sick of hearing the words open source supply chain security like every 2 seconds? I see a lot of foundation staffers raising their hand. But by law, our work must be for the benefit of all users of Rust. It's in our bylaws, it's in the US tax code. We exist for the public good. We do not exist for the needs of any specific member. And this gets cemented even further by the fact that when it comes to setting the Foundation's high-level goals and objectives, the Rust project has just as much power as our member companies do. So let's talk about how the Foundation's priorities actually do get set. So the staff is somewhat self-directing, but our high-level goals are ultimately set by our board of directors. But who controls our board? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. All right, let's get serious. Hey, Midjourney, who controls the Rust Foundation? So the actual answer is that our member companies and the Rust project have equal control. And this is really important to understand. So the project has 5 seats on our board, and the number of seats that our member companies hold changes over time as our membership changes. But even though the number of seats varies between the two groups, they actually have equal power. So for a board vote to pass, it requires a supermajority vote of both our member directors and the project directors. So this means that if our member companies somehow managed to all agree to come together and wanted to do a big corporate takeover, which good luck getting that organization in the first place, but even if that happened, and they wanted to somehow use the Foundation to wrest control away from our open source contributors and take over the project, they would also need to figure out a way to get 4 of our 5 project directors to vote with them, or it will never pass. This also just never comes up in practice. Like, the board does not vote on nearly as many things as people imagine that they do. And when things do go to a vote, it's pretty much always been unanimous. Ultimately, our member companies and the Rust project are really aligned in their priorities, and everybody involved puts in a lot of work to keep it that way. If there's a disagreement on something, our board continues talking about it before it gets to the point of a vote. In fact, the consensus building process within our board actually looks an awful lot like the Rust project. And you don't have to take my word for any of this. Virtually all board votes are recorded in our public meeting minutes, which you can find on the resources section of the Foundation website. And now it's time for another hydration break, brought to you by the Rust Foundation. The Foundation cares about Rustation hydration. After the talk, please make sure you stop at the Rustation Hydration Station, presented by the Rust Foundation, conveniently located next to registration. So now I've spent nearly 30 minutes talking to you about the Foundation. You might be wondering, why the fuck should you listen to me? Well, my role at the Foundation is communities advocate. Now, you'll notice that this is communities, plural. And that's because the Rust community is not a monolith. And my job is to make sure that the Foundation is acting in the best interest of the Rust project and all of Rust's communities. I'm here because after spending more than a decade working in open source full time, I have some really fucking strong opinions on how broken open source funding is. And I want to see the foundation make sure that open source contributors today don't have to deal with all the bullshit that I did, because it's really exhausting. And I also care a lot about integrity and transparency of both the project and the foundation. Just about anybody who's worked with me can vouch for the fact that if I saw something that I was concerned about or that I thought people in the community should be concerned about, I would be really loudly and really publicly ringing all of the alarm bells. And while we've had no shortage of recent controversies within the foundation or the project, I'm really confident that both organizations have been taking the right steps to improve themselves as they find flaws. And it's important to me that people know when you see me talk about the internal workings of the foundation, you're not getting a sanitized view. You're getting my honest opinion on the matter. And that is, even if that view isn't flattering to the foundation. My coworkers did get a chance to see this talk before I gave it to all of you, but I had full editorial control over its contents. And anytime you see me speak up on things happening within the project or within the foundation, that is always the case. Part of my job is to keep open lines of communication, both with the project and with the community. If you have questions or concerns about the foundation, or you just want to yell at somebody about something we did, or if there's something that the foundation could be doing to support you, please don't hesitate to reach out through any of these channels. I'll also be around for the happy hour after this, so don't hesitate to come find me. And thank you so much for your time, and please don't forget to stay hydrated.